Steam and Sorcery, a transdimensional adventure starring Phineas, Frakture, and Sir Vlishginath, the Cleansing Light. Episode 12, written by Joseph Gatch and Daniel Mitchell, read by Fentriss O. Moore. Phineas had done many stupid things throughout his life, but this had to top the list. Rocketing skyward, clutching a bomb that was about to go off against his chest, he looked down, trying to gauge his altitude and the destructive force of the device. As the bomb chirped faster and faster, Phineas tried to come up with a way to get the bomb farther away and still get out of the blast radius. Why he was doing this for people he didn't know, much less care about, was beyond him, though this was in a way his fault in the first place. Something about that encounter with Vlishginath's god changed him in some way. Before he arrived in Ascension, Phineas was alone in the world, literally. Despair filled his life. There was no hope for being anything but an observer in the parallel worlds that he visited, and he had all but lost the will to go on. The sudden change of heart had him puzzled. The deity mythos was nothing like he expected, not a wrathful or vengeful god that would be preached on the street corners, raining brimstone and cats and dogs on the unpenitent. Mythos seemed more like a tired parent or teacher running herd on a pack of unruly children, something Phineas could relate to. He continued to struggle with ideas of how to gain more altitude. He just wasn't rising fast enough. Phineas slapped his forehead with the palm of his free hand and cursed himself. Basic physics, you idiot. He didn't have to go higher. The bomb did. He was too heavy, but the bomb alone wasn't. Phineas quickly pulled off his right boot, deactivating its jet. Shoving the bomb inside, he tightened the buckle to keep it from dislodging. He then reactivated the jet and sent it on an upwards trajectory high into the sky. A sudden sinking sensation overcame him as the remaining kicker jet could no longer keep him aloft. "Oh, crap," Phineas muttered as he began to plummet. Down below, on the top of the church balcony, Vlishginath was joined by a battered-looking Maximus. "You look like hell," Vlishginath said with a grin. "Everything all right?" With a single dark chuckle, Maximus tossed one of the mechanical troll's arms onto the ground, the mess of scrap metal landing with a loud thud. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Vlishginath nodded, clasping hands with the half-giant and engaging him in a half-embrace before continuing. "How are the others?" Glancing back in the direction of the fighting, Maximus shrugged. "We've got them on the run. Where's the little guy?" Vlishginath looked upwards, taking care of his device. Then glancing over towards Maximus, Vlishginath smiled, taking on a reverent tone. "We saw the All-Father, Maximus. He appeared to us." Maximus growled. "Hardly seems fair. We're the ones out defending the church, and that undeserving heathen gets a vision from Mythos?" Their ears suddenly popped, and there was a sound, like air leaving a bellows followed by a crack of thunder as the atmosphere rushed in to fill the void that the Malandi bomb had left. The uppermost part of the bell tower suddenly disappeared, sheared off without a trace. A hole appeared in the clouds, letting a beam of sunlight through and encompassing the church in brilliant daylight before the clouds returned their cover. A cheer from the citizens and soldiers below rose up, taking it as a blessed sign that the day had been won. Vlishginath and Maximus looked at each other confused. "Was that it?" Maximus asked. "I believe it was," replied Vlishginath. He strained his eyes, looking for any sign of the professor. A small black dot, high above, began getting bigger and bigger as it approached them. Soon, they could hear the long, continuing scream of the plummeting man. Vlishginath and Maximus both wondered how this was going to end. Phineas was heading straight for them, and they wondered if it was possible to catch him. Phineas shouted something just as he approached the balcony and suddenly slowed and then gently landed between them. With a wild look in his eye, he regarded the pair before him. "Air brakes," Phineas laughed. His merriment was cut short, however, when Maximus's enormous hand wrapped itself around Phineas's neck and lifted him off his feet. "Welcome back, traitor," Maximus said, a dark tone in his voice. Vlishginath's hand quickly set on the giant's arm. "Put him down, Max. I believe the professor has seen the error of his ways and has adequately atoned for his sins." "What he said," Phineas gasped, his face turning dark red. "Fine. Maximus released his grip and Phineas dropped to the floor in a heap, rubbing his neck. Glancing back up, Phineas nearly flinched when he saw a hand moving in his direction, only to realize it was Vlishginath, the church knight giving him a single nod as he reached out. Taking Vlishginath's hand, Phineas allowed himself to be pulled effortlessly to his feet. Vlishginath chuckled as he clapped Phineas on the shoulder. "You've made it back to us in one piece, Frakture. Nicely done." His eyes were going wide. Phineas exhaled heavily and nodded. "Yes, although I'm afraid your bell tower looks a little worse for wear." Turning, the three of them looked up. The perfectly level sheer where the bell tower had been consumed by the explosion, standing in stark contrast against the midday sky. Smiling, Vlishginath turned back to Phineas. "For as long as the Church of Mythos has stood, so too have her enemies sought to bring her down. It will not be the first time we've rebuilt, and it certainly will not be the last." "Well, at least you're taking it in stride." Much to Phineas's amazement, the rebuilding process began far quicker than ever he had anticipated. The streets cleared of any sign of a conflict almost immediately, so that construction could begin the following morning. Within a matter of days, what could be saved of the bell tower was preserved, that which was no longer structurally sound being torn down and removed. Materials arrived shortly thereafter, and Phineas watched in awe as stoneworkers and carpenters from within the city flocked to donate their time and skill. "Rebuild often, do you?" Phineas asked, standing next to Vlishginath, as the two watched the walls of the new steeple being raised. Grinning, Vlishginath leaned his head towards Phineas as he spoke, his eyes never leaving the workers. "The world can be a dangerous place, Frakture, but the people are glad for the church's protection, and when she bleeds for them, they rally to see her mended." "There you are," came Garadane's voice, followed by the clacking of a wooden staff on stone ground that heralded the lore master's approach. The two of them turning simultaneously, Phineas frowned suspiciously, but Vlishginath bowed his head politely as he spoke. "Good morning, lore master. What can we do for you?" "We?" Phineas asked, quirking a brow at Vlishginath. "You'll be happy to know," Garadane said, giving Phineas a stern look, "that I've uncovered some news pertaining to your arrival, and potentially a way back from whence you came." "That's the best news anyone's told me since I arrived," Phineas exclaimed, his eyes going wide. "I take back all of the unkind things I said about you, Merlin." Furrowing his brow in confusion, when Garadane glanced at Vlishginath, the church knight simply shook his head and shrugged. Pushing through the doors of the Arcane University, they were immediately greeted by a pair of students, garbed in the light blue robes that were the university's uniforms, with a simple rope belt tied around their waists. "Greetings, lore master. If you'll follow us, which one of you was it?" Phineas cried out, pointing an accusatory finger at each of them in turn. Reaching out, Vlishginath quickly grabbed hold of Phineas's wrist, pulling it down and away from the apprentice Magi, and taking an apologetic tone. "Forgive the professor. He is eager to return home, is all." Yet even as Vlishginath gave Phineas a sidelong glare, the professor refused to be silenced. "The hell I am! I want to know which one of you is responsible for this debacle." Then, leaning close to Vlishginath, Phineas spoke in a hushed voice. "Trust me, Arthur. If there's one thing I know, it's how to deal with unruly students." "Yes, as we were about to say, if you'll follow us, we will lead you to the arcane laboratory where the experiment backfired." "All right then," Phineas said with a stern nod, turning and giving Vlishginath a grin and a wink. Vlishginath's eyes widened as he gave a patronizing nod of approval. Making their way into the room, it was clear that there had been an explosion of some sort, the stone walls still scorched black despite obvious attempts to scrub them clean. In the middle, a large, circular metal archway, not unlike the one Phineas had constructed, stood attached to a number of arcane power cores, with several students working busily on it. One in particular looked up as the five of them entered, brown eyes made to look abnormally wide by a pair of thick goggles half hidden by a mop of messy blonde hair. "And this must be the professor," the young maid said, wiping greasy hands off on his already grease-covered robes and offering one to Phineas. Reaching out, Phineas grasped it in turn, shaking it lightly before reaching for a handkerchief in his breast pocket. "Not a bad setup you have here. Let's have a look at the schematics." "Oh, I've got that taken care of already," the young maid replied, pulling out a dingy-looking scrap of paper and coming to stand next to Phineas, looking over it with him. "The math was just wrong." "Show me where," Phineas said, Vlishginath and Garridane stood off to the side and watched on in silence. See? Right here, the mage answered, pointing with his finger. Forgot to carry the decimal. Chuckling, Phineas shook his head. Rookie mistake. Grinning embarrassedly, the young mage nodded in agreement. The good news, though, is that I am confident I can replicate the event and send you safely back home. Narrowing his eyes suspiciously, Phineas glanced up at the young mage. How confident? Give me numbers. 97.36 repeating percent, the mage replied. Phineas drew in a deep breath and sighed. That'll have to do, I suppose. Under Phineas's careful guidance, the final steps of the process were completed, and as the archway thrummed to life, a flickering blue speck formed in the center, expanding outward and covering the two-dimensional surface area contained within the circle. In unison, an excited shout came up from all the students who had been working on the project. The young mages bursting into applause as hands were shaken and congratulations were doled out. Smiling with satisfaction, Phineas turned to Vlishginath, the church knight grinning as the two of them shook hands. Well, Arthur, wish me luck then. I do not believe you require luck, Frakture, Vlishginath replied. I have seen the many wondrous things you are capable of, and no one with such a brilliant mind and natural talent has need of luck when he is so capable of forging his own destiny, sometimes in a literal sense. When you and I first met, I saw a man in despair, grieving over what he had lost, and eager to give his life in the destruction of a hated enemy. After traveling and fighting alongside you, I can say with absolute certainty that such a course of action would be a tragic loss, the likes of which your world has never seen. Do not deprive them of your mind, Frakture. You've been given a gift, and your world would undoubtedly be a much darker place were it not for your light. Honor the memory of your loved ones through your actions in life, and do not be in such a hurry to see that light extinguished. I believe that your reward is still to come. Blinking, Phineas opened his mouth, and for a moment words failed him until finally he was able to stammer his response. I will. Thank you, Sir Vlishginath, and well said. His grin widening, Vlishginath nodded once, reaching out and clapping Phineas on the shoulder one last time. That done, Phineas sighed, turning to face the portal. Well, hopefully this will take me home and not some outrageous world where people turn into dragons or something. His brow furrowing, Garridane puffed his pipe briefly before speaking. Again, you speak of something as if you already know. How did you come to learn of dragons and their shape-shifting capabilities? I've read more than my fair share of fairy tale books, Merlin, Phineas replied. Chuckling, Vlishginath shook his head. You said the same of sorcery once, you know. Yes, but I've also seen concrete physical evidence to the contrary. I mean, really, what's the chance of a person turning into a dragon? An utterly preposterous notion. It would take a deluded mind to fully conceive such a world. Phineas shot back as if daring either of them to contradict him. While it is true that dragons are known to take on human form, Garridane began, Phineas looking over to him and fully expecting the lore master to come up with another outrageous tale. I must admit, the notion of a man, or woman for that matter, taking on the resplendent draconic form is, well, rather far-fetched. That said, the three of them nodded in unison when the voice of the blonde mage interrupted them. We can't keep this open much longer. Right. Phineas pulled out his MRT and tried to activate it. To his surprise, the device suddenly jumped to life. I'll be damned. It must be the proximity to the portal that is making it work again in this world, Phineas said, nodding to Vlishginath and Garridane in turn one last time. Be well, Frakture, Vlishginath replied, clenching his right fist and tapping it to his left breast in the formal salute of the church knights. Grinning, Phineas pulled his goggles on, carefully stepping up to the shimmering surface of the blue portal. Well, here goes nothing, he muttered to himself, activating the MRT, drawing in a deep breath and bracing himself before stepping briskly into the unknown. Screaming like a banshee once again, Phineas fell through the vortex until he slammed onto a hard cobblestone surface, knocking the wind out of him. Once he could finally breathe again, he quickly covered his face with a cloth to keep the harsh winds from blasting his lungs. He looked around and spied the gyrocopter he had flown. He had returned to the exact spot he had left. Unfortunately, he had been away so long that his assistant had probably destroyed his lab and work already. Flying back to his lab was slightly difficult in the winds, but perseverance paid off, and he arrived safely at his home. Nothing seemed to be disturbed as he walked through the door. His assistant looked up from watering some plants and gave him a quizzical look. "Back so soon, sir? Did everything go according to plan?" "What do you mean, so soon? I've been gone for days. You should have turned this place to rubble by now." "If you wish me to do so. However, by the clock on the wall, you have only been gone 20 minutes. Phineas let out a slight grin. "Just like magic. A concept that is based upon fairy tales told to children and not rooted in fact," the automaton answered. "If you only knew," Phineas said to himself. Frakture's Journal. As I prepare for one last journey via the MRT, I can't help but reflect upon my recent travel to a mystical world that was in no way like my own. I had started out with vengeance in mind against a man who I had no real reason to hate other than that he was a darker reflection of myself. Along the way, I too fell to that darkness and almost destroyed an entire city in order to gain what was once lost to me. How easy it was for Orlocks to manipulate me for something that I longed to have again. And only through the cleansing light did I find purpose in my life once again. No longer am I alone. He has shown me that wherever I go, I can eventually find peace in my life. What if this last alternate world I visit will hold the key and I can find a new home? And what if he is right, that my reward is still to come? What if? Phineas looked up from his notebook as a crash of thunder shook his lab. The storm is getting worse, he thought to himself. Better get moving or Mythos knows where I'll end up this time. To be continued in the short story, Fractured Reality, available within the 7 Wars compilation. Phineas, Frakture, and Sir Vlishginath the Cleansing Light will return. Their adventures are not over yet.